Also shout out here to my ACTA fellows. We have the Traditional Arts Roundtable program staff, Betty Marin, Julian Carrillo, and Jen Jameson. Thank you all for all of your work and making this possible. So who's here? Who's in this big room all together? So we've been asking in the chat, you can share your name, your artistic practice, or your organizational affiliation and where you're joining us from. So what a wonderful group of people here. As we begin, I just, many of us who are able to are staying at home as we do our work and our part to minimize the spread of COVID-19 virus, but also recognizing that others are continuing essential work to keep our communities going. At ACTA, we have 48 staff members across the state, and everyone is currently working from home. A lot of those workers are the artists who work in the state prisons, and they are also working at home, and we're prioritizing the development of alternative programming across all of our work. And we're very grateful for the broad and deep traditional arts community of relationships across California and our ability to continue our work in your service. We've also been reminded of how traditional arts practices are so deeply rooted in the home, in the intimate connections between family members. We're reminded that these practices and expressions have survived generations of change and upheaval. And we are reminded at their core that the traditional arts are adaptive, generative, and resilient. They root us in shared history, but they also help us grow in uncertain times. So we're inviting you right now, if you want to share with us in the chat one thing you're grateful for. Just a little housekeeping here about our Zoom practices. For your safety, we have everybody on mute. You can type your questions in the chat and we'll share some of those during the Q&A sessions. Also, if there's people who are just on the phone, we'll give you a phone number to text questions. You can text Julian Carrillo on the ACTA staff, and his mobile number is 415-345-6162. And I'll be repeating that number during our Q&A periods. And we'll also be recording this session and posting it to actaonline.org and broadcasting it to Facebook Live on ACTA's Facebook page. You can find us at the Alliance for California Traditional Arts. So just a little review on our agenda here. We're going to focus on 2 government programs that are providing relief funding to nonprofit organizations through the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or the CARES Act. First, we're going to hear from the National Endowment for the Arts. We're going to hear from Cliff Murphy and Jen Hughes from NEA, followed by a Q&A. And then secondly, we're going to hear about the Payroll Protection Program, also part of the CARES Act, from Ethan Zatko at FMA, or Fiscal Management Associates, followed by a Q&A. And at the end, we'll point to some other resources for other types of support. So we're going to kick off here with the NEA colleagues. I want to introduce these wonderful colleagues with us. We have Dr. Cliff Murphy, who's the director of the Folk and Traditional Arts Program at NEA, National Endowment for the Arts. He oversees the endowment's grant making in the folk and traditional arts, and he manages the NEA National Heritage Fellowships. He also serves as the acting director of presenting and multidisciplinary works. Joining him is Jen Hughes, who's the director of Design and Creative Placemaking for the National Endowment for the Arts, where she oversees grant portfolios that support the design and creative placemaking fields, as well as leadership initiatives that include the Mayor's Institute on City Design and the Citizens Institute on Rural Designs. So we'll turn to NEA, and we'll be hearing their presentation followed by Q&A.
Well, thanks, Amy, and thank you, ACTA, for hosting this. I think it's this is a real honor and privilege for us, and it's we're grateful to ACTA for really giving us a chance to be able to get the word out about these resources during a difficult time. I do, before we get into that, just in looking at the names of people who are checking into this, I mean, there are extraordinary people on the line here, not the least of whom are, I see several National Heritage Fellows who are taking part in this webinar. And so I do want to give a shout out to them. That's the nation's highest honor in the folk and traditional arts. And it's a privilege to even be in your Zoom company. So, so thank you. And, thank you to ACTA for your great leadership in the folk and traditional arts, both in California and nationwide. You have an incredible team. So thanks. My friend and colleague Jen Hughes is going to walk us through a little bit of a PowerPoint here that just lays out some of the basics of the CARES Act funds that Congress allocated to the National Endowment for the Arts for COVID-19 relief. I want to give a really basic introduction to that, which is to say that approaching these funds is a little bit of a culture shift, both for the staff at the Arts Endowment and for people who have been coming to us for support for years. What I mean by that is, legislatively, we are typically constrained to making grants to organizations for project support. And so nearly every conversation that we have with would-be grantees revolves around this idea of what is the project that you're requesting funding for. We typically do not make operating support available. The CARES funding, on the other hand, is for operating support. And so I think that this is really going to require all of us to step temporarily into a different frame of mind when it comes to requesting support from the Arts Endowment. So the primary purpose of these funds is to preserve jobs and to maintain fees for contracts for artists and for contract work that organizations have that they won't be able to pay without this relief, as support for utilities, rent, if your organization mortgage payment on that building, these sorts of things. So basically maintaining jobs and the lights on metaphorically at organizations. I gave a webinar yesterday in which I said that this was about keeping the doors open. I meant that metaphorically and realized that under the current circumstances, that's a terrible metaphor. So, so this is about keeping organizations running, keeping jobs in place. And so with that said, I'll ask Jen to kind of begin walking us through this.
Sure. Thank you so much, Cliff. Thanks to ACTA. It's an honor to be in everyone's presence. If we could go on to maybe slide 3, moving through our presentation. I think Cliff gave a really great overview of just what the CARES Act is all about at the agency. As you may know, $75 million was given to the NEA to distribute as part of the act. 40% of that already has gone out the door directly into the hands of state arts agencies, regional arts organizations, so they can sub-grant out within their state. So it's really key that you keep an eye on their programs and funding opportunities that should be coming online very shortly. 60% of the funding is going to be distributed via direct grants. So the agency will be awarding roughly $45 million to direct grants all across the country. And as Cliff stated, the intention is really to retain as many jobs as possible, as quickly as possible, and to keep the lights on. I'm gonna sort of edit our text there, Cliff, thank you. So if we move to the next slide, this is really where we begin, and it's about the eligibility of the program. For organizations to apply, they must be a previous NEA award recipient from the past 4 years, meaning that they were awarded a grant between fiscal year 2017 up to and including awardees that are being notified this week of grant awards and funding. And we know that's a really big challenge because it sort of is not all encompassing, but this was a way in which our agency really strived to be able to be effective in getting money out the door, acknowledging the limited bandwidth we have as staff, and really knowing that our current grantees have been vetted in the past. So that is the pool of folks that are eligible to apply. And we just want to emphasize that if you do not fall into that category, make sure that you're really following the state arts agency funding. Local arts agencies will also be distributing NEA funding. So that is really critical for you to keep your eye on if you don't fall into this eligible bucket. Just some other highlights. You must meet the legal requirements, meaning your nonprofit status at the time of application is still up to date, or your unit of government or federally recognized tribal government. And lastly, have submitted final report packages by the due dates. We're being really flexible here in wanting to work with our existing grantees, noticing and acknowledging that it's a really challenging time, and have extended across the agency, I think by 3 months, those final report packages. Just be in touch with us so that we know that it's on your radar and you can plan and modify accordingly with your discipline specialist. And lastly, it's one application per organization. On the next slide, I think this is what Cliff really touched on, but we want to emphasize and hammer this home. You're not applying for a project. You're applying for a direct grant to support salaries, full or partial, fees for artists and or contractual personnel, and facilities costs such as rent and utilities. These are direct $50,000 grants. That's the single amount that you can apply for. So that's what your budget should include, expenses for $50,000 that fall into one of these 3 categories. I think the really great news is that these grants do not require any type of match in the way that our NEA grants typically require that one-to-one match. There is no match requirement for the CARES Act funding opportunity. It's also important to emphasize that these projects could extend, or not projects, excuse me, this support could extend up to 2 years. So if you're a small organization and you're thinking about applying and trying to think through how you spend that $50,000 in these 3 buckets, I would just encourage you to really be creative, because you can apply for support that extends for up to 2 years. On the next slide, we have our application timeline. These are due very, very soon. So for those of you who are NEA grantees, you've made it through the grants.gov application process before. You need to do that for step 1. Don't miss this deadline, April 22nd by 11:59 p.m. Eastern time. That's just the simple SF424 as you're typically applying to the agency. And then part 2 is where you will submit to the applicant portal. There's the window there. You can copy paste your prepared materials into the portal April 27th to May 4th. And then we're moving very, very quickly to announce those grantees and notify them of award in June, for the earliest beginning date being July 1st of 2020. So on the next slide, I just have a screenshot up so you can see on our website on arts.gov under the CARES Act, drawing you to these application materials. What I'm pointing to in this red arrow is part 1. Click on that to just follow the detailed instructions on submitting to grants.gov. And on the next slide, part 2 is really the meat of your application. This is a PDF that you can download. You can see all of the questions here now. And again, the instructions are very specific. It's intended to be very simple in applying for this opportunity and program. And just as an example, you're typically probably used to coming up with a nifty title to apply to an NEA program, including a really cool project that's going to last from 1 to 2 years. This is solely operational support. We actually give you verbatim what you should be putting into some of the categories. So for example, the project title is CARES Act. You don't have to do anything beyond that. And again, you're really in the project description only talking about the job positions for which you're seeking support, the artists or contractual personnel. And here's even a prompt: in 2 or 3 brief sentences, describe facilities costs that are requested. So that just gives you a little sneak peek. We want organizations to be really specific and very succinct to the point, and we don't want this to be a laborious process for everyone. So that's something to pay attention to, and you can download that PDF now and get your application responses prepared and ready for the submission deadline. So on the next slide, we just introduced the review criteria. So be thinking about this as you pull together the application. And this review criteria, some of which looks like something you might be familiar with before, but specifically that first review criteria, potential to have a significant and immediate impact on the arts workforce. This is really about jobs, 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 and maintaining them in the arts and cultural sector. The significance of the mission and core work of the organization, the ability to carry out an award, including the appropriateness of the budget. And lastly, as appropriate, the extent to which the organization serves underserved populations. So this I would just call you back to time and time again as you're applying, because if every eligible applicant submits an application to the agency, we anticipate being able to fund between 20 and 25% of the organizations that come in the door. So I would just encourage folks to be very clear, very concise, and I'll speak to the next slide in a moment about our application review process. So we are putting this through as a panel process. As many of you are familiar, we adjudicate all of our grant applications through a panel reader process. So some of you on the phone might even be tapped to serve in that capacity. So the first round will go through a discipline-specific panel review, and then there will be a large cross-discipline panel. And I think it's important for folks to know that. So you're really thinking of speaking about the significance of your work and your organization to people that may not be familiar with what you do. So make sure that you are really advocating for your organization very clearly and articulately, so that somebody with a theater background might have an understanding of the work that you do, where they might not be familiar with your organization in the past. And lastly, I think it kind of goes without saying, but this is a real emphasis of the CARES Act program. Like all of our grant programs at the agency, we really are seeking to impact a broad constituency, looking to fund projects across the geographic range and a wide range of organizations that serve underserved populations. So we'll be serving and supporting both large and small organizations in places all across the country. So the next slide is just a reminder of those deadlines. Again, if you aren't able to submit in part 1, then you're not going to be able to move on to part 2. So just don't miss that April 22nd deadline. And I think it's also worthwhile on the next slide just to acknowledge and note that we do still have our other upcoming NEA deadlines. The Grants for Arts projects, the next deadline is July 9th. Our guidelines are already up on our website. And the Our Town grant program will be soon releasing guidelines mid-May with an August deadline. So you can apply to both CARES for this operational support, as well as these other grant opportunities at the agency. You just want to make sure that you don't have overlapping costs in your project budget. That's important to keep in mind. So with that, on the last slide, I just want to make everybody aware that the NEA staff is extremely accessible, wants to be in service to the field and to all of you, and feels incredibly passionate at this moment in time in particular. So we are all really anxious and eager to help. We have that link there that's really specific to all the discipline specialists that are standing by to answer your questions. So do not hesitate to reach out. I would say shoot them an email in addition to maybe giving them a call, just because we too are moving, or we've been working remotely for the last month. And I know that emails always make their way there, and the telephone forwarding can be hit or miss. So with that, I just wanted to wrap up and give the space for questions.
Thank you so much, Jen and Cliff. And we always have this wonderful experience working both of you and your colleagues at NEA. And I want to really encourage people to know how accessible you really are. And it's always a great way to get to know you and work with you around this, but also around future grants and projects. I'm going to turn right now to our program manager at ACTA, Julian Carrillo. He's compiling the questions in the chat, and he's going to start asking some of them to Jen and Cliff.
Yes, thank you, Amy, and welcome everybody. Keep those questions coming. We have 3 of them so far. The first one says, must the direct grants be used only for one of the 3 categories? Salary support, fees for artists and personnel, and facilities costs.
So I'll give a quick answer, and Jen, I don't know if you want to elaborate. You know, you can request support for all 3 of those categories simultaneously, but you can't request support for things that are outside of those 3 categories, right? So we're not asking you to come into only one of those slots or 2 out of 3. It can be any combination. It's just that when you actually write in the narrative and the budget, just make sure that if you're asking for support for multiple lines in your budget, you know, let's say some for salary, some for facilities, and some for contracts, just make sure that the budget that you submit and your narrative match up with one another. That's it, Jen. I don't know if you have anything to add there. All right, next question.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, can we apply for less than $50,000?
You cannot. The only grant is for $50,000, and no more, no less. It is only $50,000 grant. As Jen mentioned earlier, you can have a 2-year period of time in which you're drawing down those funds, but it is only a $50,000 grant.
Yep, and I think it's worth just emphasizing that point, Cliff, because we're looking to fund organizations of all sizes. And so, you know, there might be an organization that's requesting that $50,000 support for the next 4 months, or an organization that's really spacing it out over the course of 2 years. So don't let that high number discourage you from applying, because you can really think creatively about that period of support over 2 years.
Thank you. The next question is, can you apply if you currently do not receive an NEA grant, but are receiving state arts agency funding?
So you need to have received a grant directly from the National Endowment for the Arts between fiscal year 17 and fiscal year 20. So that's basically over the last 4 years. And if you haven't received funding directly from the Arts Endowment, then you are not eligible to apply directly to the NEA for CARES support. However, you can and should be in contact with your state arts agency and your local arts agency in order to see, you know, each state will be developing its own guidelines and its own schedule for administering its CARES funds at a state and local level. But in terms of coming directly to the Arts Endowment, yes, you have to have received a grant directly from us in the last 4 years.
Thank you. Fourth question is, there's an organization who has been funded before by the NEA who is asking about eligibility. They have requested an extension of an additional 18 months in June 2021. They want to know, are they eligible?
As long as they were awarded their grant, you know, they are a fiscal year 2017 to 2020. They absolutely are eligible to apply. So you can have a current open grant that might be extended out. Again, we would just caution you to make sure you're not double dipping. So if you're asking for position support that's already captured in another project budget for an overlapping period of time of this CARES Act opportunity, to just be cognizant of that and make sure you're parsing it out thoughtfully.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, if an organization has a modest cash reserve, does that put them less eligible for a CARES Act grant than an organization that is functioning on or over the edge?
Jen, do you want to take that one, or?
I mean, I think it's really hard to say and hard to anticipate. You know, we shared sort of the bullets of the review criteria that are, you know, pretty specific to the guidance we're going to give to the panelists and reviewers that are going to be reading the application. I think it's fair to acknowledge that there is significant need by organizations all across the country. So while it's not an explicit review criteria, I can imagine it coming into the panel consideration process. But, you know, I think, again, it's less about sort of that cash reserves and more about making the case of a job or an artist's contract that would otherwise be lost due to this moment in crisis, and how this money can really be a stopgap for enabling support for that position, that job, etc. And Cliff, maybe you have a better answer than I do, but that's
No, I mean, I think that there's not a simple answer to this. I mean, I think that when you consider the circumstances right now, I think that, and you consider the number of applications that are going to come in, the tenor of these applications is going to reflect what people are going through, which is that we're in a time of acute need across the country. And I would anticipate that every application that comes in is going to reflect that acute need, and it's going to, and each applicant is going to express that directly and dramatically and appropriately. So, you know, I think the other thing is that we really do. I think that you're going to find that the recipients of these funds are going to cover a very wide spread of geography, demography, genre, mission, right? This is a big country, and just thinking within the arts, it is extraordinarily diverse in terms of the missions of every organization, the size of every organization. There's not a size or a mission that is privileged over another. This is an ecology in which, you know, our agency sees value in many approaches to the arts, and so you know, we're committed to trying to serve organizations in all shapes and sizes and spaces. And so, you know, I don't know that there is an Achilles heel for any of these applications. You know, cash reserve being one of them. And I think, honestly, the only Achilles heel is if organizations are trying to approach these funds as a creative opportunity for new programming. I think that because we are all people and organizations that are deeply committed to serving artists, there can be an inclination to want to figure out how we can access these funds in a creative way that creates a new opportunity for people. And I think it's really important to look at the intention of the legislation around this funding, and to look at the guidelines and the language within it, in terms of the attention of this funding, which is really to maintain existing jobs and programs and organizations. So stay focused on that. And in your narrative, make sure that you are indicating to readers who you're serving, so that if your organization is negatively impacted by COVID-19, that mission and those people and those communities that you serve are not going to be reached because of this. That is ultimately what is going to make your application distinct. Is your mission. And yet we're not giving people a lot of space to move in the narrative here. These are pretty tight applications, And so you have a small space to move within. And so just be clear in your language and in your storytelling. And yeah, and I mean, this is tough for everybody. I want to clarify one thing that I just saw come across the line, which was just somebody asked if they need to have received direct NEA support in every year between fiscal year 17 through 20, or if it's okay to have just received one grant in that window of time. And it's sufficient to have just received one grant in that period of time. So.
Thank you so much. We're going to move on with our presentations, and I know there's still some questions on the table. And I would just ask Jen Hughes and Cliff Murphy, maybe you can respond to some of these other questions we didn't get to in the chat while we're continuing through. Thank you so much to both of you. We're now going to turn to Ethan Zatko, who's a consultant with FMA, Fiscal Management Associates. He's based in Oakland on the West Coast team, and he provides consulting and advisory services to nonprofits, philanthropic, and government funding agencies. So the FMA has put out some great toolkits and advice on the CARES Act, and particularly the PPP, which is the Paycheck Protection Program. So we've invited him to share more about that program, as well as provide some very critical updates about that program. So thank you, Ethan. We'll turn to you now.
Thanks so much, Amy. I'm really glad to be here. I appreciate ACTA for hosting. And something that message no one here may know about my background is, in a past life, I spent many years running a nonprofit community arts center here in Oakland, Destiny Arts Center for my Bay Area folks on the line. So I really do feel at home with my people here. I'm really particularly pleased to be having this conversation with you today. So as Amy mentioned, I'm a consultant with FMA, Fiscal Management Associates. We work exclusively with nonprofit organizations and their funders around this area of financial management. And in the past few weeks, have really stepped up in partnership with the folks we work with in the sector around this Paycheck Protection Program, PPP financing opportunity that is really in an unprecedented way open to the nonprofit sector, unlike prior stimulus programs that haven't been available to our organizations. So I did want to bottom line up front start with, many of you may be aware of the headline from this morning announcing that $350 billion, the total amount of PPP, has been expended as of today, which is true. The guidance that we are offering in response to this announcement today is the following. If you are prepared to apply, you should still apply. B, if you are preparing to apply, you should still prepare to apply, because A, it is possible that lenders still have an allocation of funds to service. And B, it's also very likely that Congress will authorize further funding to this program. It's obviously not something I can guarantee on this call, but it's what we expect will likely happen. And so because it's a first come, first served program that we have seen roll out at breakneck speed since April 3rd, when it's been open till today, you want to be in a good position to apply for any new round of funding that comes down. So I'm starting just with the first two slides indicating the free publicly available resources that we have available on our website. It includes an expanded version of the deck I'm going to walk through right now with a lot of granular detail about the different calculations you'll need to be performing as a part of your application to this financing. There's a really wonderful calculation tool for anyone struggling with those calculations. It really does a lot of that work for you. We're offering public clinics, at least today and tomorrow. I don't know to what extent they'll be extended next week, but please feel welcome to join us for one of those clinics for further guidance. In addition, if you go to the next slide, we have an open inbox, which is email that we're just monitoring all the time and responding to whatever queries you might have relative to applying for this financing. So I have quite a bit of material. I'm going to try to move through quickly, and then I'll be interested to respond to what questions you have. If you go to the next slide, I will just describe that in basic, and then the following slide, of course, In the most basic sense, what this is, it's a loan administered by the Small Business Administration, and it's designed to provide a direct incentive for small businesses and, really for the first time, nonprofit organizations to keep their workers on the payroll. So great to keep that framing in mind as you navigate what kind of questions or complications you're encountering with the application of the process, that's the basic perspective for why this funding was made available. It's designed to keep folks on payroll. And what's really been so exciting about this financing opportunity in particular is that the SBA is going to forgive loans, essentially turning it into a grant, if all employees are kept on the payroll for 8 weeks and the money is used for payroll, rent, mortgage, interest, or utilities. And we'll go to the next slide to learn more. So I'm going to be covering today, can you apply? Are you eligible? How much you can borrow, what you can use the loan for, and how much will be forgiven. So on the next slide, you'll see that you're eligible to apply if you have 500 or fewer employees who principally reside within the United States. You must certify that the current economic uncertainty makes the loan request necessary to support your ongoing operations. And I want to specify here that there is no further needs test to this financing. You don't have to demonstrate need, and this is purposefully this attestation is a very wide umbrella that almost all organizations reasonably fall under. So really important to understand that, yeah, there's no like further demonstration of need required. Nonprofits have to be a 501c3 or 501c19 veterans organization, and you must have been in operation on February 15th of this year. The next slide, in terms of how much can be borrowed, it's 2.5 times a very specific monthly payroll calculation. Payroll in this case, including salaries, severance, paid leave, some benefits, and some payroll taxes. So for example, if after you perform that calculation and determine that your average monthly payroll is $100,000, you can borrow $250,000. It does have a $10 million ceiling. Know that these loans are serviced by banks, right? So they're backed by the SBA, but they're serviced by banking institutions. And that lender that you are applying with is the one who's technically going to set the amount. So you'll perform the calculation, you'll provide backup documentation, and then the lender will then perform their own set of calculations and set the loan amount. We have this really great calculator, as I mentioned, available on the website. We update it as the guidance gets updated, which happens all the time. But that being said, if your lender has their own calculator, certainly use theirs. Next slide, what you can use the loan for. You can use it for payroll for 8 weeks. The total loan must be at least 75% used for payroll. And then in addition, you can use it for utilities, rent, mortgage interest payments on other debt, as long as those arrangements were in place by February 15th of this year. On the next slide, of course, everyone is very interested to know how much will be forgiven, up to 100% if you do the following things. You keep or increase your FTE. FTE stands for full-time equivalent, so you maintain the same level of staffing, as well as you don't decrease salaries by more than 25%. The loan will be forgiven. If for whatever reason you're not able to do those things, the amount of forgiveness will just be reduced based on a calculation. And for any amount that's not forgiven, it's a 2-year loan at 1% interest. So if you're interested, on the next slide, you need to, if you have an existing banking relationship, you need to reach out to those folks and confirm that they're an SBA approved lender and that they'll be processing PPP applications. And if not, if they are not that, ask for referral. That's going to be your best source for referrals. Understand their application process and what documents they'll require. It is different bank to bank. They all have their own portals. They're requiring their own sets of documents. So being sure to understand exactly what they are requiring is essential. Secondly, get authorization from your board via resolution to apply. It's likely that your board bylaws require such authorization to take on debt, so get that if that's the case. And then gather payroll data from the last 15 months, so January 1-19 through March 31-20, which is going to aid you in establishing how much you can borrow and to get through that calculation to determine your monthly payroll. On the next slide, I want to point out a very specific question on the application, which is really it's a simple application outside of that payroll calculation, but a lot of folks are getting hung up on this question because the program is designed for the small business community. And although it's open to us, they didn't really take us into account when designing the application. So there's this question around ownership. Of course, as nonprofit organizations, we do not have owners. So if you're being forced because you're using an online portal to fill out these fields, we have a little bit of guidance about how to address that, indicating NA and 501c3 in the name section, and then just using the data from your organization for the rest in like incorporation date instead of birthday, et cetera, et cetera. We'll go to the next slide. I mentioned different lenders on the next slide are requiring different documentation. So you'll need to check with your lender, but they're likely to request the completed loan application and that evidence of 12 months of payroll data. And I think maybe we'll go to this next slide. Sorry, I didn't paying attention to the animations, which is what I just discussed. And then we'll go one slide further, which goes into the likely process that you'll encounter, which is especially for larger banks, there's like an informational inquiry that you'll complete. You'll then be invited to upload documents. They'll verify your information, ask any questions. The lender sends it to the SBA, and when you're notified and you'll be given documents to sign, you are then you'll then receive your first disbursement within 10 days of being notified. So if you aren't in a relationship with a bank that is an SBA lender or your bank isn't accepting applications, like I said, ask for a referral on this next slide, ask your network, ask your funders, any recommendations they have. I am aware of some intermediaries that are accepting applications like Divvy and BoFly. These are not banks. I'm aware that US Bank was accepting applications for non-clients. And then you can also just go to the list of SBA approved lenders and cold call them. I know I'm in a rush, so I'm going to suggest we quickly move through the next slide, which is, and then the one after that, which is my tips and tricks. It's first come, first serve, so be prepared to move quickly. There's no fee. If anyone is charging you a fee to apply, they're in bad business. The guidance is evolving daily. Be sure to check our resources. We update them every day. And yeah, it just ends with slides, again, recapping those free publicly available resources I mentioned. So with that, I know I'm out of time and happy to address your questions. And thanks for your patience with my speedy lingo. I hope you all caught that.
Ethan, thank you so much. We'll turn to questions now. Julian has been compiling them as we've been speaking.
Yes, question number one, quote, I understand there was a delay in availability of funds for independent contractors or sole proprietors. Is it therefore true that all the funds were expended before that application possibility was opened? End quote.
So that, in fact, is not true. Those applications, you're correct that there was a separate process for 1099 independent contractors that opened on April 10th. So there has been the short window since April 10th in which those opportunities been open. However, I want to keep it very real with this intimate audience of people that I feel connected to, in that it has been a clunky process on behalf of lenders, right? So banks have had to quickly get their systems and processes up to speed, and it has been absolutely imperfect. So it's possible that although the opportunity has been open since the 10th, that any given lender may not have been in a position to accept applications in an efficient way as of the 10th. But that's the response.
Thank you. Another question is, can you speak to folks who are applying as a sole proprietorship and how they might prove payroll costs in order to have them forgiven?
Sure. It's a little bit outside of my area of expertise, working directly with nonprofit organizations. I'm aware, I believe that it's going to be based on prior year tax data. But if you go to our resources, there are some links that I think will be likely leads for you to learn more.
Thank you. Another question is, what if you have contractors running your arts programs?
Unfortunately, independent contractors are not included in the payroll calculation as they have their own process for applying for direct funds for themselves. So when you as an organization are performing that calculation, those people will be excluded.
Thank you. We have a long one here. It says, our org has applied for a PPP loan and an EIDL loan too, but it is unclear whether or not these will be funded. Do you recommend we keep folks on payroll even if they cannot work administrating and presenting public programs? Or should we lay off / furlough employees until SBA funding is secured?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question. I do recommend that you keep folks on payroll to the extent that you're able. If it's going to challenge your ability to operate into the future, of course you have to face those hard decisions. I would be curious to know from this person when they applied for that the PPP loan. It might help indicate likelihood that it will become funded. So that might be another interesting follow-up to know. But essentially, there's no, I don't have really wonderful guidance in this area. It's a tough choice that you're going to have to make. I will say though, I don't think this is exactly what you're asking, but others might be curious. Mention the EIDL loans that are additionally available through SBA. It's a different financing program that pre-exists the CARES Act, although through the CARES Act, they've activated a $10,000 advance to those loans, which is new and different. And the two do not preclude one another. So most certainly you can apply for EIDL loan as well as PPP loans.
Thank you. Another question, do contractors count as employees?
They do not, and it's specifically because they're eligible to apply for their own PPP on behalf of themselves. They do not count as employees.
Okay, another one. Where do you find the application for sole proprietors? They were not able to find it.
It should be, feel free to reach me directly at this FMA Cares email and I'll follow up. It should be on the SBA site, fairly simply, but if that's not the case, I'm happy to dig a little bit and help direct you.
Many arts nonprofits don't have full-time staff. How do nonprofits classify consultants and independent contractors count as FTEs?
So again, for the purposes of this particular financing opportunity, independent contractors and consultants do not count towards your FTE. And I'll also specify, I will jump onto this question by mentioning that for the purposes of the application, they're actually looking at headcount, which is different than FTE. So headcount is individual people. So one full-time and two part-time might be 2 FTE, full-time equivalent, but it's 3 people in terms of headcount, right? It's 3 folks. However, when it comes to forgiveness, so if you get the financing and then you're looking at how it's going to be forgiven, they are looking for you to maintain your FTE. So your FTE full-time equivalent at the same levels. There's a funny discrepancy there, application versus forgiveness. Where to qualify forgiveness, you're going to be maintaining the same number of FTE, although those do not have to be the same individual people. It's just the FTE count.
And we have one more. Somebody applied with Wells Fargo last week, but they have not heard back. Does that mean they have to wait for the next round?
So there's no standard answer to this, and it's the type of challenge that a lot of folks are experiencing navigating this funding. The best guidance I can offer is to be in close touch with your loan officer or your best contact at the bank to learn more. Of course, they are inundated with a lot of communications, but that's the only way you will know the answer to that question. I'm going to guess that the answer is no. I would not expect that you're returning to the back of the line, but there's no way for me to specify definitively, and your loan officers will be able to tell you that.
There's another question. Any support for fiscal sponsored organizations?
It's a really great question. It depends a little bit of your model of fiscal sponsorship. So if you're model A, where you're essentially employed by your fiscal sponsor, you'd have to work with your fiscal sponsor to consider that question. If they can apply, they would be the folks applying, it would not be you. and what that arrangement might look like. If you're like a Model C, where you're essentially like a 1099 or some other legally organized entity yourself, again, you would apply through that opportunity as a 1099. There is a caveat I should mention that if you are Model A, fiscal sponsor employed by your fiscal sponsor, and they have more than 500 employees, then unfortunately not eligible.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're close to our time here. I know there's probably a few more questions there in the chat, and we can continue responding on the chat, but we're going to move to wrap up. And before we do that, we want to share our website page where we've been listing resources, kind of a curated list for traditional artists and arts organizations. We're updating this daily. We'd love to hear from you if you think that there are really relevant resources that you found that we don't have here. We'd also really like to hear from you, with ideas that you have. We're here at this time for you. We can have more webinars and speakers and sharing in this time. The resources that are available are horribly insufficient. I know like we see an opportunity open and with hours, it's all used up. So I think our message is to keep trying, like Ethan was saying, to prepare, to get your house in order, to prepare for the PPP if you can, and that there will be more available resources coming, not just from the federal government, but others, and we will continue to provide updates. One thing I did want to mention about individual artists is this resource called Artist Relief that's administered by United States Artists up here at the top, where a coalition of national arts grant makers have come together for and they're providing $5,000 grants to individual artists in dire financial strife. Their deadline for cycle 1 is April 23rd, but they're going to be having deadlines rolling out in cycles over the next couple months. And also, I would just urge you to keep checking for your state arts agency in California. Our California Arts Council will be really ready to spread the word when it becomes clear how the COVID CARES Act money will be dispersed. So our state arts agencies and also our county and local arts agencies either have resources going or will be. So we'll be continuing to share that information. And just to close, I want to just invite you to stay tuned to our social media at CalTrad Arts to learn about upcoming traditional arts roundtables or join our New Moon newsletter on our website. Also on Wednesdays and Fridays at noon Pacific time, you can join us for Shelter Together, where we're doing Facebook Live and Instagram Live feeds of visiting traditional artists in their homes, sharing their cultural practices. And then finally, we'll be having some more upcoming roundtable sessions focusing on the connections between engaging in traditional arts and culture and health and well-being. So we're building the plane here while we're flying. We don't have the dates yet, but those are coming soon. And then finally, I just want to thank our speakers, Cliff, Jen, and Ethan, for responding so quickly and so robustly to share with us today, and want to thank everyone else for joining us. Stay well, and ACTA is here to be of service to you. Please reach out to me or any of the ACTA staff with ideas you have, stories, suggestions. It's an honor to be of service. Thank you.
Thank you. Be well, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Amy, there is an announcement from Jason Jong. It's a short one.
Okay, let's hear the
this.
announcement.
Okay, so he was able, from the CAC, he was able to step in for a little bit. And he says that if folks have questions around CAC funding via CARES, they can be encouraged to sign up for the CAC's weekly Art Beat newsletter. And by going to their website, Additional details will be forthcoming in the following weeks.
Excellent. Yeah, and the CAC website there, can you repeat the website where people would go sign up for that? California Arts Council for California. We have a lot of national people with us here today. Thank you, Jason, for that.
Yes, well, that website is cac.ca.gov.
Okay, thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.